Hello and welcome. If you've been around competitive horse archery at all in the last few years, you're probably going to have noticed the prevalence of Slavic style. So arrow on the outside of the bow, few fingers underneath, index finger runs down the side. There are a number of reasons why this has become so popular recently. It's a little bit easier for people to pick up. This is much closer to how most people want to hold the string than something like, say, thumb draw. There's also been some very, very high scores set by some very high profile horse archers, although obviously a lot of that is the archer behind the bow as opposed to the technique itself. But today we're going to have a little bit of a look at quite how wildly different Slavic can look depending on who you are and how you're shooting it. I'm going to do this by showing you the two extreme ends of the spectrum. First, we're going to have a look at the style that generally comes with shorter length bows, shorter length draw lengths, and overall shorter arrows. Now, I'm currently square on to my target, but for shooting this style, I'm generally going to open my stance a little bit. So I'm going to be more closed, more rounded shoulder. And with this technique, I'm going to be very reliant on circular motions. So, normally using a back quiver, one of the slightly more angled back quivers like this, so they lift off at the bottom, makes them easier to get out. Really seems to be the best way to use a back quiver unless you have quite long arrows. And what I'm going to do I'm going to go to my arrow, making a circular motion over my shoulder, bring it to the bow. Now you'll notice the bow's turned over. This just makes it everything easier to find. From here I nock, I draw, and I shoot. And you'll notice quite an extreme cut throw in this technique. The lower elbows, because the draw length is shorter, so this just benefits my angle. So again, to my arrow, to my bow, on, draw, over. Arrow, bow, on, draw, over. Okay, and this technique allows you to shoot very, very quickly. The restrictions on it are arrow limit. These back quivers are harder to get really large numbers of arrows in. You're not going to manage more than a dozen, 15 at best, with the best ones on the market. There is also a lot of movement. Now, this isn't necessarily bad, but keeping all of these movements consistent is much harder than something that's more fixed. So, what about holding arrows in the hand with this technique? Something that shows up a lot, and you'll see most of the top horse archers do some variant of it. You actually won't as much with people using this particular way of shooting. And primarily, because putting arrows in front of the bow with an aggressive capture tends to go a little bit wrong. It feels quite awkward. But what you will see people doing is shower shooting. Now, the number of people willing to do this mounted is quite limited, and I understand why. You have really no ability to go for the reins. You can use your bow hand, but it is a lot more awkward, so I understand why the majority, especially on a horse they don't know, don't. But from here, my arrows come onto the string, turn the bow over, and I shoot in exactly the same way. Again, there's a lot of motion in this. That sounded expensive. There's a huge amount of movement in this, and again, I am limited on arrows. I can do 3 like that reasonably well. I don't think I've seen anyone pull off more than 5, and even that's quite uncommon. Okay, so from the exact opposite end of the spectrum, we now have a much longer bow, a much longer draw length, and much longer arrows. Now, usually you will see a prevalent of sword style quivers. I personally can't bear these. I don't like using them. I find they get in the way a lot. I find they affect my shooting far too much. This one's already bothering me with where it's fitting. But these are what you're generally going to see. And this is because it lends itself to a very linear style of shooting. So, my stance is going to be much more square on, much more like a traditional target archer. I'm also going to be a lot quieter in my movements. They're going to be very deliberate, very quick, and then they're going to stop and a new one's going to happen. So, for my knocking, I'm going to find my arrow. It's going to come back, through, on, draw, shoot. Much less capture, much less explosive. This is linear shooting, so everything moves in a straight line. Straight line from the quiver, straight line to the bow. Straight line on, straight line back, and shoot. And again. And as you can see, everything stays really straight. Now, from a purely biomechanics and taking joint stacking, this is better. The body is working more efficiently, my joints are more in line, so I'm using more skeletal strength as opposed to muscular. Lots and lots of benefits. And then when I go over to shooting from the hand, I can hold a lot more arrows. Now, I've got 6 currently. You can essentially do as many as you like. I have managed 11, but it's not the nicest thing on my hands. And again, these motions are going to be incredibly linear. So back, onto my string, draw. Something like that. So with this linear style of shooting, for an event like Tower, where I'm really reliant on constantly targeting the same thing, because there's so little movement, this is practically unbeatable. It's why the Kashai style of using your fingers was so prevalent for so long. This being marginally easier to learn, I think, is now taking over and replacing. Where this becomes a little less advantageous is I'm using quite an unwieldy bow. My arrow length is much longer. So on faster events where you want the horse at a higher speed, where a lower centre of gravity is useful, it's useful to have that slightly more option to close up a bit, because I can keep my centre of gravity much lower, which is where our first style comes in. And you'll clock this. This big, long, linear technique tends to dominate in Tower, whereas the lower technique tends to be more effective in Ride, where going faster is more important because the accuracy is lower because the target's so close. So, at the end of all that, is there a best option? The answer's probably not. It's probably still the one you find more comfortable. From a coaching perspective, the more biomechanically sound one is the one I am more inclined to teach towards, unless there's a reason you can't do it. Just athlete longevity, that sort of thing. It's going to be the one that is going to keep everything sounder and everything straighter, whereas there is more that can go wrong the more movements you put in. So I'm leaning towards longer bow, longer arrow being the better of the two, but there is certainly nothing wrong with the shorter style. I just see it as more moving parts means more could potentially go wrong. Thanks for watching.